Hello team, welcome to another ATPGEO Politics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update, and it is the first one for a good long time. I wonder when the last one was, the 21st, so this is an 8-day update. I keep leaving it far too long, so there will be quite a lot of change to the front line, and I have to be honest with you, most of it is in favour of the Russians. They do seem to be pushing and prodding. There are a couple of areas that are really of concern for the Ukrainians. We're going to go to the north first of all, into the Sumy area where the Russians appear to be pushing down into Sumy from Kursk. Here we have the Novosilka area where the Russians have pushed down south of the border and then further to the west as well. And they really appear to be making some inroads here. Although, first of all, it's worth noting that most of these gains are put in by Suryat Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, but that is to say that the Russians will have attacked in most of these places, if not all of them, even if they don't fully control that area like Suryat Map says. What is worth noting is that the Ukrainian defences, the main defences, will be south of there anyway, so it's not great to see the Russians take Ukrainian land in a fresh place on the map, but they haven't yet reached the front lines there, if you like. It's definitely not cool. There are some small Ukrainian gains, as according to Suryat Maps by Tetkino. I would say this is very late to the party for Suryat Maps there, and Andrew Perpetua's had a much larger area taken by the Russians for a good long time, so I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. This is definitely a worry. The rumours are potentially that the Russians are going to attack into Sumy, that they are amassing troops in this area. It's one of the three areas that have been mentioned. So we've got sort of Sumy up there. There are claims about Zaporizhia variously, potentially even around the city of Zaporizhia by the reservoir, sort of going up north there, but also obviously all over the place on the Donetsk front. But it could be, around Pokrovsk, up here to Kostiantynivka, but also claims that they might strike kind of westwards to Dnipropetrovsk Oblast to try and get a toehold in there. So lots of options for the Russians, as well as obviously Chasiv being still an area where they could attack to try and get into Kostiantynivka from the north. So all directions there potentially, and then of course still operating on the northeastern front line here around Torska and Terny and whatnot. So yeah, all of those options are available to the Russians. The Ukrainians clearly struggling to develop sizable forces to try and push the Russians back, it appears. Okay, a couple of analyses about what's going on. Visioner here says escalating tensions, Russian strategic maneuvers in Ukraine. So a bit of an analysis from them. Despite weeks of threatening signals from the Russian side regarding the opening of a new front along Ukraine's northeastern border, under the guise of creating a so-called buffer zone, an impression created by the Russians of a major offensive along the Chernihiv-Sumy-Kharkiv line, it's anticipated that the primary objective of Russia's summer offensive campaign will remain the Eastern Front and the Donetsk region. In this context, the threat of an attack in the north should be viewed as a false manoeuvre designed to tie down Ukrainian reserves. Now, I think this is quite plausible, and it's sort of like what the Ukrainians did with Kursk, but it's in reverse. So Ukrainians attacked up there into Kursk to try and draw Russians away from Pokrovsk. They actually drew Russians away from right across the front line to stop them doing the sorts of things they're doing now, which is like moving in a number of different areas along the front line. Kursk did work, but then they were beaten back and out of Kursk, and now the Russians are attacking down to Sumy. That the idea would be to draw Ukrainian reserves around to be able to then take advantage of a lack of Ukrainian rotation, reconstitution in certain areas like Pokrovsk, like Chasiv and Turetsk areas. Okay, so if Russian forces achieve success in the east, leading to the demoralization and weakening of Ukrainian troops. This northern threat could then become a preparatory stage for subsequent operation of new territories. Currently, the situation on the eastern front in the Donetsk region is alarming, yet there's also an opportunity for effective defense and for neutralizing the objectives of the Russian command. Now, it's worth noting that Zelensky did call short a trip just the other day to come back to Ukraine, supposedly because there are worries about that northern area of Sumy. So he had to come back to make sure, things were all right as commander-in-chief, if you like. The situation on the Donetsk front, they say specifically regarding the situation since early May, the Russians have renewed their attacks on the Donetsk front, primarily targeting the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka line. This line should be considered the gateway to the defense of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. If this line is captured, battles will directly shift to the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk defensive line. Okay, so let's put that in onto the map in the context of what's going on. So you've got Kostiantynivka there, which is becoming more and more threatened from all directions here. So you've got Turetsk, New York. The Ukrainians seem to be pushing back in Turetsk, trying to hold the Russians at bay there. The Russians are seemingly finding greater success further to the west. And what the Russians appear to do is a lot of this, which is, okay, we have intentions of taking, say, for example, Kostiantynivka, originally from Chasiv. Didn't work. Let's try Turetsk. Didn't work. Let's try Pokrovsk region, but kind of veer up this highway rather than go towards Pokrovsk over there, although it seems they're doing both. And that did work. So it's kind of prod until they find a weakness. It's kind of like the deep battle doctrine of the Russians. Attack everywhere until you find somewhere that's a weakness and then pile in at that weak point. And that seems to be what they have done here. And they're getting most joy from attacking in this southern direction. But if they take this area here and take Kostiantynivka, then that leaves Kramatorsk, Druskivka, Kramatorsk, Slovyansk, then vulnerable from the south, rather than from this difficult eastern direction where the Russians have struggled to get through Bilohorivka. They've struggled to get further past these kind of Bakhmut lines down at Chasiv. But actually coming from the south now becomes a major concern for the Ukrainians. Over the past month, the Russians have managed to cut the highway connecting Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka, as we just seen, creating a flank threat to Pokrovsk. This flanking maneuver is a key factor in the current war, enabling the advance of Russian forces. So just to go back here, the area we're talking about, this T0504 highway that comes from Stupochki and Ivanivska direction from Bakhmut, south of Chasiv, then goes around to Pokrovsk here. They've cut that highway and now they're able to consider going north to Kostiantynivka northeast, or coming across, flanking Pokrovsk from the side, rather than these attacks from the south of Pokrovsk that have been pretty much stabilized by the Ukrainians over the last 6 months. So the Ukrainians have just about held the Russians back here along these major defensive lines south of Pokrovsk. But the worry is that they could come through Manoeuvre from the east, but also, of course, use that as a launch pad to attack Kostiantynivka from the south and this semicircle of larger towns and cities, this agglomeration, as Visioner mentioned. In this scenario, there is a risk that Russian forces could outflank and encircle Pokrovsk from the northeast, trapping the Ukrainian garrison stationed there. This leaves the options of either abandoning the city or remaining to fight under siege, both of which would be tragic and would accelerate the onset of battles for Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Given this reality, it's critically important for the Ukrainian General Staff to make swift and comprehensive decisions to ensure that necessary measures for the defense of Pokrovsk are not ultimately too late. Initially, it's expected, and signs are already emerging, that Ukrainian reserves, which have been resting for months, are now appearing on the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka line for defense. These forces are unlikely to settle for passive defense and will likely initiate effective counter-offensives and counter-strikes against the attacking Russian forces using active defense mechanisms. This strategy proved 100% effective during last year's Pokrovsk defense campaign, enabling the city's protection before Russian forces even reached it. The situation is indeed difficult. It's also a fact that since the Russians launched their offensive, they believe they possess sufficient capabilities and resources for both a high casualty offensive in the east and a genuine threat in the north. This, at least at this stage, forces the Ukrainians to keep a certain portion of their combat reserves to defend Chernihiv, Sumy, Kharkiv. So the Ukrainians are in a difficult position because you've got all of these options where the Russians could attack broadly in three directions that are, and probably all three, that could lead the Ukrainians to pull in all of their reserves, meanwhile attacking up in Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and the Ukrainians needing to have troops significant amounts of troops up there to combat the Russians in what they're doing. My thoughts would be, I was talking about this in my hits and losses video this morning, and it's been at the back of my mind for some time, actually, when we have seen these huge drone huge drone attacks into Russia using sizable enough one-way attack drones. Can the Ukrainians utilize those drones to hammer the Russian lines here? Like, if you've got 300 attack drones that you're sending over a night or two into Russia, deep into Russia, to hit these factories, well, could you get 300 drones and send them all at this one area of the front here and absolutely hammer? Imagine having 300 sizable attack drones plus lobbing in artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, HIMARS, Gimlet guided multiple launch rocket systems, and everything. Just absolutely batter the crap out of the Russians here. I wonder whether they are worried that there might still be Ukrainian civilians living there, as they seem to hold out insanely in some of these places. We've got Kiev Independent saying Russia has amassed enough troops to attack Ukraine's Sumy Oblast, according to border guards. Russia, quote, has enough forces there in Kursk Oblast to carry out operations against our border and attempt to attack the territory of Ukraine, said Andriy Demchenko, State Border Guard Service spokesperson. These are the dilemmas faced by the Ukrainians. Okay, now let's go to, we've done the Kursk Oblast and into Sumy. We're going to just come out a little bit and go along the road. So not much going on in the Belgorod regions where the Russians had been attacked by the Ukrainians, just over there. No news there in 8 days. Some gains for the Russians, it appears, in the center of Vovchansk. This is a worry. The Ukrainians had been keeping the Russians at bay and had been taking back small areas there previously. But it seems like the Russians, according to Syriac maps, are expanding their territorial advantage and control to the east of this sector, but also in the center of Vovchansk. Both mappers agreeing that. That is a worry, I would say. And it could indicate that the Ukrainians have had to pull forces from Vovchansk to other areas of the front line. We have some small gains for the Russians at the very northern tip of the northeastern front line, north of Kupyansk along the Oskil River. And actually some both gains and a bit of push and shove here from the Ukrainians retaking maybe a little bit of land, or it could be a rejig, but the Russians having some success north of Kupyansk, which again is a worry if that is the case, particularly with the one directly north that Syriac maps has there. No change to the Pischani front line for 8 days. That's good news for the Ukrainians. Hopefully they can concentrate elsewhere. Some gains around Sahivka, Nadia. This is Novosilka sort of area north of Novosilka. According to Syriac maps, we have, what do we have in, that's the Torska area. So this is coming further to the south. So we'll get there in a second. Okay, in fact, we'll get there next. As we come further down, we can see that according to Syriac maps, at least, the Russians are making some gains all over this sector. You have Terney here. That's still, actually, Andrew Perpetua does not have solidly under the control of the Russians, and Yampolivka area too, with Syriac maps having the Ukrainians push back all the way down to the north of Torska. And it's this kind of area that we're going to talk about, with some claims that Ukraine has pushed back here. Play for in the Liman direction. First of all, though, Russia dangerously expands its bridgehead and attacks Torska. Ukraine's defences are not in the best shape here, and Russian FPVs harass Ukrainian logistics extremely effectively, forcing retreats. So here is a thread. We're going to be talking about the Zhebelets River area as it comes down here. So we have a number of these sort of reservoirs and whatnot around Yampolivka, Terny, and then down to Torska here. That's where we are at. In the very last days of 2024, Russian forces were able to cross the Zhebelets River, and in early January 2025, the settlement of Ivanivka, situated on the other side of the river, was captured after a failed attempt. A lesser known specific about this series of attacks is the fact that the Russians exploited the dried up reservoir, which significantly helped, and through which the main infantry attack was concentrated. The armour instead flew into the village through the road. So that is Ivanivka, which is up here. So we're talking about this area, going across the road there, but actually using the dried up reservoirs to also send troops across. So there we go. After the taking of Ivanivka, a chain reaction occurred. Russian forces moved both along tactical heights and through forests and in the local gullies exclusively with infantry, and due to the disorganization, very small numbers of the Ukrainian units that they were able to advance more than 10 kilometers, capturing the vital settlement of Manoeuvre. This settlement, other than being important because of the sheer rarity of urban areas in this sector, was the key to the dominant hill system behind the Zhebelets River, as visible from picture 2. This way, the Russians will be able to threaten with encirclement the Ukrainian grouping of forces between Kupyansk and Manoeuvre by simply advancing along the same height instead of uphill. So here we have, if we come out a little bit, Manoeuvre up here, there, that's where we're talking about, and just trying to find us Kupyansk. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah, so we're talking directly north. So this is Manoeuvre they're talking about, and then advancing up here to Kupyansk. So, it's connecting these two sectors. This one, what I was calling the Pischani sector, and then the Terny Torska sector. If they can join them up and equalize that front line, then that seems to be what they're trying to do. Okay, so moving on, and that is where we're talking about. So up there in that direction. So going, why did the Russians do this river? Oh no. It's annoying. Twitter does this as well as Blue Sky. After 5 months, we have a situation in which the Russian bridgehead is 18 kilometers wide and 11 kilometers deep. Kharkiv is only 6 kilometers away, and Pisky Radkivsky 17 kilometers, Shandry Holove 9 kilometers. But why did the Russians do this river crossing? The most likely answer is splitting up the Ukrainian Logistical bridgehead another time, just like up north at Pischani. At the end, the Logistical bridgehead, only 3 smaller ones will remain, which will be much more easy to deal with for Russia. Keep in mind that these bridgeheads, these would be in semi-operational encirclement, as they would have the Logistical River on their backs, with only a few crossings to use as a retreat or logistical routes. These crossings are and will be controlled extremely closely by Russian forces, and would make supply and retreat virtually impossible. In general, the Russian strategy has always been this: threaten the encirclement and force a withdrawal on their terms and controlled by them. That is forcing maximum casualties while Ukraine retreats. As such, this threat has not to be underestimated. It's not to be underestimated because we have river crossings that we can use to retreat is not an excuse anymore, as it unfortunately was in Velyka, Novosilka. Really worrying stuff, you can argue. Going back to the Liman sector, here is a defensive configuration of the Ukrainians in this direction. The picture is in high resolution. Feel free to zoom in or to download. Okay, so we have this area. So that is, I think, Kupyansk down to Manoeuvre there. But we also have Liman further to the south. So let's just put that on my map. Here we have Liman down here. that the Ukrainians, I remember reporting an awful lot on, the Ukrainians fighting back here during the counteroffensive and taking all of this land. And now it seems the Russians are moving in reverse there. About a month ago, the Ukrainians, seeing the worsening of the situation in this direction, started to place in all haste Dragon's Teeth and dig anti-tank ditches in this direction. In particular, the double ring around Liman was extended to cover Chandrila-Holove. Then it goes into the Nitrius River, and then it continues behind it and Kharkivka all the way to Izhumsk, situated on the tactical heights that he's talked about before. Furthermore, we're able to notice new anti-tank ditches covering Lozove and Pisky-Radkivsky, still unfinished. We were able to also find some trenches south of Lozove and east of Rubtsy, but nothing was dug behind the Nitrius River. Indeed, the river is a halfway point between the Zhebelets and the Oskil and constitutes Ukraine's next and last defensive line before having to withdraw much further back. So you've got this river essentially between the Zhebelets River and the Oskil River. So the Oskil River is this large one here, Zhebelets there, but there is another smaller river here, so Chandrila-Holove here, and these are the areas where they're starting to build defences, double ring around Liman, defences around here. They could use this as a kind of last-ditch defensive line before you get to Oskil. I've said, this whole area isn't too much of an issue up here. You can use Oskil as your major defensive line. It would be a shame to lose Liman. That I think is a real issue, because it then, Izium then becomes very much in play, Sloviansk as well. So it's really important that I think just down in this southern area of this northeastern sector that the Ukrainians keep the Russians at bay. So on the map that you see there, you've got trenches in the red areas, blue are Dragon's Teeth, and yellow are anti-tank ditches. So you've got anti-tank ditches around Liman, a double ring, and then also Dragon's Teeth in a number of different places. Okay, so obviously the defensives that you see featured in the two pictures previously are hardly to be called such. It is extremely far from what's needed to stop the Russian advancements in the area, and furthermore, I think it's the wrong strategy in the first place. Let me explain. The area is mostly characterized by big fields, forests, and little urban islands, separated by small rivers and hills. The Russians are going to eventually take all the land up to Kharkivka, and very likely further too. The resources used to dig massive anti-tank ditches in front of Lozove and Pisky-Radkivsky should be used to fortify the areas west of Kupyansk and Liman, other than digging at Oskil and Bukina, which are the settlements in correspondence with the dammed area on the Oskil River and are extremely important to deny Russia another bridgehead over the river. If the Ukrainians were to retreat from the Oskil bridgehead in an unorderly manner, which is very likely to happen given the current conditions of the higher command, holes might form east of Izium, which would give Russia a bridgehead over the river. So what we're talking about here, issues of getting past the Oskil River. You really want to be putting up a lot of resistance here. The mention of Bukina there and Izium itself. You do not want the Russians to get really this far. So anyway, as Playfra is saying, as such, I think the correct strategy is enacting a delaying action in the Oskil bridgehead territory and dig defences in the forested areas and behind rivers to give time to strongly fortify the areas I've talked about. In this strategy, the Ukrainians should not shy from retreating from a position at the first sign of high casualties, as they would want to conserve everything for the defence of the Oskil and Seversky Donetsk crossings, while causing maximum casualties and exhaustion to Russians when they actually reach the positions they prepared with this time. So that's kind of where I presume it's talking about there. But anyway, in conclusion, I do not view the situation as any good for Ukraine here, and the Ukrainian command should already start sketching out plans for the withdrawal from the Borova and nearby areas. So Borova is further to the north and is another place that the Russians appear to be aiming for. They've long, I think, been aiming for Borova. That's why they initially attacked and got across the Zhebelets River in this area, the Ryarodka area, Novosilka, Nadir. Then the Ukrainians pushed them back there, but they were, I think, making a bid for Borova. Well, actually, that is now much more realistic since they've already made it to the Oskil River further to the north. And, you know, you've got worries about them making to the Oskil River further to the south. This is the key area that is of concern. I'm not saying that the situation is critical as of now, but the threat is without a question there behind a corner, and a Russian breakthrough can happen at any moment without proper reforms that I and many other Ukrainians have already talked about countless times. It should have happened months ago, if not years before. This is inevitable. Moreover, special attention should be given to the destruction of Russian drone pilots that, covered by the massive infantry assaults distraction, have been operating and, from the words of Ukrainians, multiplying by zero Ukrainian logistics all over the front. Okay, so interesting analysis there. It's looking slightly worrying. Some claims that the Ukrainian forces have recaptured Torska, mentioned here. So Torska, you know, I don't know that you can claim it's been captured, although Surrey maps claims that the Russians are into the northern areas of this part of the map, but claims from other sources that the Ukrainians have recaptured that area, pushed the Russians out, so that it doesn't look like this. And indeed, Yampolivka up there, some claims that Yampolivka is, you know, there's some successes here. AFU reportedly advanced west of Yampolivka, so good news for the Ukrainians there, and that would be in this kind of area. So the Ukrainians could be pushing back here to try and stem the tide, you know, going southwards. But of course, it's this threat going westwards that is also an issue. So that is that neck of the woods. And then we come down, still so much to talk about, come down to Chasiv Yar. Unfortunately, the Russians seem to be advancing in Chasiv Yar, as according to both mappers, in the center of Chasiv Yar. And that is definitely a worry. So the Russians have some momentum there. When we come to Torska, Turetsk, the Ukrainians pushing back a little bit north of Druzhba and Doctrine area, as according to Syriac map. So that's good news there. Indeed, let's have a look at that. So here is where we're talking about. The Ukrainians liberated the northeastern part of Doctrine in a Turetsk direction. There's this thin line of control for the Russians up that railway line that you can see here. But yeah, according to that other mapper, according to Grayskull, the Russians push back here as well. So Ukrainians still trying to hold on and push the Russians back in the in the Turetsk area. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, here another claim to successes there. Reports of further advances around Turetsk. So this is the Doctrine area we're just talking about. Now we're talking about quite considerable areas of Ukrainian control to the west of that, the spoils here, the spoils heap here. So that's the kind of area we're talking about, including up to that kind of watercourse area. So that's to say none of this is in control of the Russians, as according to Grayskull. Syriac Maps has a wildly different interpretation of what the Russians control around here compared to Andrew Perpetua. As you can see, Andrew Perpetua's mapping is all around here. Russian control lines there. Syriac Maps much further to the north and to the west in all of these places. So yeah, that is happening. Right, and then we're talking about Kostiantynivka, and another thread there concerning Kostiantynivka. Euromaidan Press reports that Russians are throwing tens of thousands of troops at one Ukrainian town. The math is brutal. 1 in 10 Russian soldiers in Ukraine may be marching on Kostiantynivka right now. Next stop, Kramatorsk, Ukraine's last line of defense in Donetsk Oblast. Major fight coming. So this is all looking rather worrying. There's your larger map. You've got Kostiantynivka. This is Chasiv Yar. This is where they've attacked north along the highway. They could then go to the west there to attack Pokrovsk, kind of northwest, but also northeast to attack Kostiantynivka and flank it from, the other side. You've got Chasiv, and then you've got what's going on in Turetsk and New York here. If they can have success there, then it's, functionally encircled to a very significant degree. Let's go through this thread. In the Kostiantynivka direction, the Russians have started a serious offensive operations to flank the city from the west and breach Ukraine's little number of prepared defences there with the help of new drone innovations. After the Ocheretyne breakthrough, says Playfair, in April 2024, the Russians captured many important positions and settlements around the town itself. One of these was Novosilka. Okay, just to let you know where we're talking about. So let's zoom out a little bit here, and we're going to go to this northern area where you've got, where was Ocheretyne? It seems so long ago. This was a success for the Russians as they were moving out of Avdiivka. Avdiivka there was the huge controversial taking of that's kind of opened up this whole region for Russia to gain. Ocheretyne was this area that seemed to be pretty important, that the Ukrainians held the Russians back, and from there they were able, the Russians, to advance kind of all over the shop. So we go back to Playfair here. So we had Novosilka was an important place after Ocheretyne, and after that capture, the Ukrainians successfully halted further Russian advances towards Vovchansk. So this was, and I report on this quite a bit, so this was the attempt to get to the junction on this T0504 highway where you got Vovchansk there. This is Novosilka after Ocheretyne back here. It's back here. So the Russians were kept here for an awful long time, and although there are a few attacks across this junction and fighting for it, and they may well have had functional fire control over this road, they couldn't quite get to that last point, and then they broke through, and then all hell's let loose really since then. But anyway, aided by a couple of rivers in the area which funneled the Russians into the village and the vast fields north of Novosilka. In January 2025, though, the Russians exploited the fact that the Ukrainians had left after a year of inactivity, only a few and inexperienced units defending this sector, and moved the bulk of their reserves to counter-attack the Kotlina salient, so that is just by Pokrovsk. Vovchansk was taken after a couple of days, but the Skala's battalion delaying actions that was hastily transferred there temporarily saved the situation by directly attacking Russian accumulation inside the village and giving crucial time to the units behind to reorganize an effective defense. Some reserves were also transferred, for example, an Azov contingent at the Klaverna interchange of the important Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka road, that's that junction I keep talking about, which conducted a successful counterattack and destroyed a dangerous Russian accumulation under an overpass that was preemptively destroyed by the Ukrainians. In the picture is where the front line was stabilized for some time. So there's that junction there that they were fighting over, and it was all around this Vovchansk village there. The Russians, noticing the stiff Ukrainian resistance in this sector, was not intending to let them pass, applied one of their favourite strategies at the end of March 2025. They changed the centre of fighting to the Alexandropol-Panteleimonivka region, about 15 kilometres further to the east. So what they then started doing was putting loads of pressure in here. That's Panteleimonivka and Alexandropol. They started just out of nowhere having great success around here, and that then obviously got the Ukrainians to kind of worry, because it was all happening in Turetsk in New York, but then it's happening between the Turetsk New York area and the existing fighting around the T0504, and again possibly deep battle strategy of prodding and probing everywhere and getting the Ukrainians to play kind of whack-a-mole, and eventually there'll be a weakness. This area had been static for almost 2 years, and the Ukrainian defenders there occupied very good defensive positions, though the Russians exploited the same thing as in Vovchansk. If that area was defended by few and inexperienced units, this area had been basically forgotten by Ukraine, and the defenders were very low quality in training. Their numbers were also incredibly low. Ukrainian soldier Muchnoy at one point reported a deficit of 3 to 4 full brigades at that moment. But just as the Ukrainians seemed to stabilize this direction too, offering stiff resistance at Valentinivka, their positions finally collapsed there too. The village was taken and the highway was passed, making Sukabalka also fall shortly after. The 2015 trench system was also lost west of Alexandropol, without even giving a fight for it because of poor command decisions. The Russian forces leveled the front with the highway here too. Seeing this, the Russians went all in and reactivated the whole sector. Most importantly, Tarasivka was finally captured, which enabled Russian forces to attempt a daring motorcycle assault into Novosilka. It succeeded, and the Ukrainians, who hadn't fully reorganized from Tarasivka, retreated disorganizedly from Novosilka. Okay, so now we're talking about what was going on around, this highway. With Tarasivka there, they had a motorcycle attack up to Novosilka, and that then was successful enough that they could consolidate and then get across a highway and take this area around Novopoltavka, so on and so forth. And now they're moving north of the highway. They've broken through the Ukrainian defenses there in a significant fashion. And here we reach today's situation. The Russians continue pushing from Novosilka to Yablunivka along both the Bychok Valley and a dominant hill behind it. Kostiantynivka is now 13 kilometers away from the front, and the Russian FPVs, which had their range significantly upgraded, are calmly flying into the city and striking Ukrainian logistics. So now, not only do you have issues, the fighting going on here, but now Kostiantynivka is easily within drone reach, and this is providing a real issue for the Ukrainians as their own kind of staging points logistics are being hit. And Playfire continues, and I want to say more about the Ukrainian logistics situation. It's been about a month or two since the Russians significantly improved their FPV drone range. Currently, the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk road at more than 25 kilometers from the front line has already suffered many Russian FPV drone strikes, both on military and civilian vehicles. So to put that into context, we are talking about this road here that connects all of these main settlements is within range of longer range drones, and that is affecting basic Ukrainian logistics. According to Ukrainian officers, the Russians are multiplying by 0 our logistics in the Pokrovsk direction. That means that even if the positions are correctly fortified and dug in, which is still rare at the moment, neither ammo, food, nor fresh personnel and reinforcements can be brought into it, basically forcing a retreat. It's gotten so bad that this problem is even worse than the well-known higher command issues and the fortification problem. The cause of this problem is actually the lack of manpower. This is because Ukrainian drone crews now account for 50 to 85%, according to Ukrainian soldiers, of their assault repulsion actions, meaning that they're focused on attacking infantry and not as many enemy drone pilots as before. This directly implies more freedom of movement for Russian drone crews, which can basically zero out Ukrainian logistics. And here is a complete defensive configuration of the Ukrainian armed forces in the whole Kostiantynivka direction. As you can see, there are a ton of defenses northeast, east and southeast, but basically none west and northwest of the city. That is exactly the vulnerability that the Russians sensed and are currently exploiting. In photo number 2, you can see a zoomed view of the area between Novosilka and Kostiantynivka. Just recently redrew the trenches here, so they're quite accurate. As you can see, this area is full of gullies and streams with ditches, teeth and trenches in between them and on the dominant height, which renders this terrain literally complicated. The Ukrainians as such still have good opportunities to stop the Russian advance here, especially utilizing the bottlenecks that characterize this area. In particular, though, reserves should be somehow transferred here, because it will not be possible to exploit these opportunities because of the lack of manpower. Then the Kostiantynivka flower will blossom for the Russians. In picture 3, instead, you can see a simplified view of everything I said here. The different colors represent after summing up trenches and their quality, barbed wire and anti-tank ditches, the good defensive lines that Ukraine has to stop Russia's dangerous advance on the dominant hill behind the Baichok River, this picture also represents the area southwest of Kostiantynivka. Concluding the previous segment, the main lines are Novosilka to Rusin Yar, partly breached, Yablonivka to Stepanivka, the one with the most potential in my opinion, and Alexandro to Kalinove to Ilinivka, the last before Kostiantynivka. So there are several lines drawn on the map there to help you. Though the thing that I'm most worried about is the one in the picture, the massive empty fields with little to no fortifications and natural obstacles in between that offer no possibility of reliable defense for Ukraine with the forces they currently have in the region. That is, if Stepanivka and its bottleneck were to be passed, the route onto Druzhkivka-Kostiantynivka highway would be downhill for Russians, as there's nothing really able to stop them. So if we go back to my map and we look now at Kostiantynivka, so some of these places we're talking about, Ilyanivka, there, Stepanivka. So if these places are breached, then you're getting around to the back to the highway that connects Druzhkivka to Kostiantynivka, and it's all looking very fragile. But this is a problem that can't be fixed easily. There have been Ukrainian digging activity recently in this region, but only some trench systems of doubtful quality and a couple of isolated anti-tank ditches have been dug. And it's not possible to safely dig more in this area exactly because of the Russian FPV drone upgrade, which would likely destroy the excavators involved. And again, I would like to point out the problem of placing an anti-drone netting. Now the opportunity was already lost for Kostiantynivka, and if someone were to try placing them now, it would turn out to be suicidal, according to Ukrainian sources themselves. What is possible to do, though, is immediately starting to place it on all the roads around Druzhkivka and Kramatorsk. This is even more of a priority than fortifications. Soldiers can dig their own dugouts in a tree line and survive there, but not if they will not get resupplied and neither food nor ammo. Add to that the morale effect of having to have your supplies always get dropped by a drone can have on an average Ukrainian soldier, which is already demoralized, and there's a recipe for disaster. I'd also like to remind people that the whole Turetsk agglomeration would also be in danger of operational encirclement if the Russians were to advance even 10 kilometers from Novosilka to Kostiantynivka, as their retreat route would likely be under almost complete Russian FPV control. I call on Ukrainian commanders to always report the truth to the higher command, which is always to accept it and move accordingly and decisively. Your decisions have a direct impact on your soldiers' morale. In other words, okay, if you end up getting to Kostiantynivka from the southwest, of course, it's going to put this whole area under complete threat. You'd be wanted to pull out of there. So this is really worrying, I think, for this front. The Russians have done a pretty good job, although it's come at a huge cost to the Russians in terms of personnel and material. They're using motorbikes effectively. They are prodding and probing. They're finding these weaknesses, and they are moving in a number of different directions here. And Kostiantynivka is now properly vulnerable, and this will then be the kind of dominoes of all of these settlements along here, and you really want to stop that from happening. So that's a massive concern. If we come further down around Pokrovsk, some small gains for the Russians, according to Suret maps, around Shevchenko, taking that back, Pischane taking that back. So that is a worry, and could well have got across some of the major trench lines there. So that is a concern. And then, according to Suret maps, quite a lot of Russian control southwest of Pokrovsk there. And then when we come further south down the front lines, you can see that the Russians are pushing the Ukrainians back all along here. Both mappers agreeing to that in the initial part of the front line. And Surat maps having much more charitable interpretation of what's going on for the Russians all the way down here, Bakatir, further down towards the kind of Velyka Novosilka area, and just continually grinding on and making these gains. So that is definitely it's all a worry on this eastern front line for the Ukrainians. Some claims that the the Russians have been pushed back around Marfapil here by Suriyat map. So that is something. There were some claims around that could be the Hilaypale claims that were from some time ago. In fact, I have got that over here. There you go. That's where we're talking about Hilaypale there. Ukrainians advanced east of Hilaypale, and that is actually May the 22nd. So that is now a week ago. But in this 8-day update, that is being featured as a Ukrainian gain there. There was also a claim just recently that the Ukrainians have made some gains at Vesely by Fedorivka here. Halfway down this larger front, here we have AFU saying, sorry, Grayskull saying the AFU has successfully counterattacked north of Vesely, there south of Fedorivka. So Ukrainians are evidently trying to push back in certain areas, but it's not looking good for the Ukrainians on the Eastern Front at all at the moment. The question is, what are the Ukrainians going to do with what reserves they have? What reserves do they have? What are they doing about the Russian ability to hit their logistics with drones? They've really picked up their drone capabilities, I think, the Russians, matching what the Ukrainians had in their advantage previously. And can the Ukrainians use things like one-way attack drones to try and stymie the Russians in these really important places? I would be focusing on this hugely. I'd be trying to hammer the absolute crap out of the Russians here with every conceivable bit of munition I could get my hands on, including one-way attack drones. Just lob everything into here. The guided glide bombs, just use them all over this area and just flatten the Russians stop them in their tracks. But what do I know? Anyway, that was a long one for me. This is an 8-day update, but also some really significant things happening in a number of places on the front line. Let me know what you think of the analysis today. Thank you to Playfra, who has some really useful threads on what is going on in a number of these different locations. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.